Switching gears here, the U.S. Census Bureau released its 2020 census data today, and it will have ripple effects across the country. It comes months after the Bureau released data on which states would gain and lose seats in the House of Representatives. The new data showed that over the last decade, major metro areas across the country continued to see population growth, while other sparsely populated counties continued to shrink. And joining us now to discuss more is Poppy MacDonald, president of USAFacts. Poppy, thanks for joining us. Want to start by talking about the effects this new data will have on the world of politics. Which states are we going to see the impact come in the biggest when it comes to redistricting?
Happy to address that, and very excited about the release of the census data at USAFacts. We thrive on government data and making it accessible. And what we saw was this continued shift of our population migrating to the south and to the west. And we saw a pickup in seats that are directly correlated with that. So we saw Utah had the largest and fastest growth with 18.4%, although they did not gain a seat. They didn't have enough population to do that. West Virginia saw a loss, the biggest loss of negative 3.2%. They did lose a seat. The states that had the big wins were Texas, where they picked up 2 seats, and states like Montana, Oregon, Colorado, North Carolina, and Florida. And so we saw a shift of 7 seats among 13 states. And states that lost were California, that did have a gain in population, but they did lose 1 seat, as did Illinois, Michigan, New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, along with West Virginia that I already mentioned.
Poppy, what is the overall impact that we can expect this data to have on politics?
Well, that is a great question. At USAFacts, we're nonpartisan, so we don't take sides in terms of who voters should elect, but we do think data should be transparent and accessible. And so, our goal is really to ensure people understand why is the census important, why is government data important, and how does that impact people's lives? And it certainly impacts representation, as we already talked about. It also impacts funding. And so $700 billion are determined based on population and counting that population and getting it to states accurately based on things like Medicare, education. And so really an accurate count is important.
We also saw that the white population has fallen for the first time since 1790. And I'm wondering, what does this mean for the U.S. demographic moving forward? What does this data mean for us as a country?
We are getting more diverse as a company. So you are right. The non-Hispanic white population dropped by 5.1 million people, or about 3% when you looked at the 2010 census and comparing it to 2020. So a non-white Hispanic population made up 64% of Americans in 2010, and now it's 58%. And we saw an increase in the Hispanic population. So there's an increase of 11.6 million people, or a 23% increase between 2010 and 2020. And you saw states that were impacted by that, especially Texas. They had a population increase, and 21% of that came from a growth in the Hispanic population. And so you saw Florida, who also had more than half of their growth attributed to the growth in Hispanic population. And California, although they did lose a seat, they grew by 2.3 million people, and 69% of that was growth in the Hispanic population.
What's behind this data? So are there trends that are lending themselves to this decline in the white population and also the growth that we're seeing in terms of other minority populations?
That's a great question. I mean, what we're seeing is we're becoming more diverse as a country, and we're also seeing a migration of population, more people going to the south and more people going to the west in terms of where they're moving. So, really are going to continue to watch this with interest. I think it'll be fascinating to see how COVID shifted some of that population, as well as how remote work may change where people are deciding to live and the demographic makeups of the country.
Do you think it also says something about just the choice to have children? I mean, we're usually speaking to a millennial audience, maybe even Gen Z. What does that mean for this generation?
That is a really good question. As we follow the data at USAFacts on how people are living, we're seeing more people are choosing to live alone, and that's creating challenges in terms of housing and a housing shortage. Also, more people are choosing not to have children or delaying having children, and so you have seen a good percent of our population increase fueled by immigration rather than fueled by people who are already American citizens choosing to have children.
Poppy, I'm running out of time, but I want to ask you this last question. We're talking about the trends of migration for more of the metro areas away from the rural areas, and that seems weird under the lens of this pandemic where we saw those patterns shift. How might the pandemic throw a monkey wrench into this data when we're looking back 10 years from now?
That is a great question. I mean, I wonder, did people relocate during the census in a time of COVID to other areas that were maybe more conducive to a lifestyle or more affordable? And, how was that going to be maybe a short-term change that was or wasn't measured in the census? And then what will that look like 10 years from now? So I think it'll be really interesting to follow.
Yeah, a lot of fascinating stuff there. Really appreciate you stopping by the show. That's Poppy MacDonald, president at USAFacts. Thanks again.